So today I want to talk about wildfires and climate change. In my two previous videos, I covered some of the different ways in which climate change is exacerbating infrastructure problems in the United States. Specifically, I talked about water main breaks and the issues of the US electric grid. Now I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about wildfires and their cyclical relationship to climate change, as well as talk about how wildfires are also exacerbating and highlighting certain aspects of capitalism, specifically around the financial costs of said wildfires, development of land near them, who is affected by them, and who is putting them out. Now, when it comes to the cyclical nature of wildfires in climate change, I'd like to start at the very beginning, at the start of a fire, where it's worth noting that there are three basic ingredients that are required for a wildfire to happen. Fire is, of course, simple. There are three components: the right weather and climate conditions, plenty of burnable fuel, and a spark. So we're going to start with the first two because they are more directly tied to what humans are doing through climate change, but the third one is actually influenced by it as well and is part of a cyclical cycle in and of itself. So starting with the correct weather and climate conditions, climate change has affected the first two aspects in measurable ways. The clearest connection is with warming of air temperatures. On average, the global temperatures have ticked up roughly 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit or a degree Celsius, where California's change has been closer to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Warming has accelerated since the 1980s to just under 0.2 degrees or Celsius or 0.3 Fahrenheit per decade, and it's likely to accelerate further in the future. Hot air, if it's not at 100% humidity, functions basically like a sponge. It soaks up water from whatever it touches. Plants, living or dead, soil, lakes, rivers, it'll take water from anywhere until it reaches 100% humidity. The hotter and drier the air, the more it sucks up and the more amount of water that can be held. That increases exponentially as the temperature rises. So small increases in the air's heat can actually lead to a larger amount of water being sucked out of the atmosphere. Scientists can measure this vapor pressure deficit, the difference between how much water the air holds and how much it could hold. If that deficit is cranked up for a long period of time, soils and vegetation will parch, which of course means droughts. And if you have dry plants, that creates kind of the second condition, where the dead stuff on the ground can be used as tinder and can be set for and ripe for fires. An early warm spring can set up a summer drought by extending the season of heat and growth, increasing the amount of water vapor that is shed by plants and leaves, or that evaporates directly from the soil. Lower soil moisture, in turn, can feed back into local warming cycles, again part of this cyclical nature, and intensify it since evaporating moisture usually takes up a lot of energy the sun beams down. When there's no moisture left to evaporate, the soil or vegetation, dead or alive, absorbs the heat instead, feeding back into the drying out process that increases the risk of fire. Now, another part of this is that in a lot of these cases, because of the higher temperatures, the snow in the area will melt earlier. And when the snow melts earlier, we find that the springtime snowpack, which usually provides about 30% of a state's summer water needs, starts to melt, and it will actually give the plants and soil a longer time to dry out, because with the water already being melted and already entering into the soil and air, there is more time for the atmosphere to absorb it and to dry it out. So the hot drying season is stretching on to the tail end and extending even further into August, and therefore higher temperatures and less precipitation are continuing into later times in the area of California. And therefore, California's Fire Protective Services have said publicly that it no longer considers there to be a, quote, wildfire season because the season is now the entire year. And so this ends up continuing as a process on itself, where the higher temperatures end up leading to much more dangerous circumstances and situations, which end up leading to drier conditions, which end up cycling into higher temperatures, which end up leading to snow melting, which ends up leading back to more dry conditions, which leads to more fires. And this ends up becoming a cyclical process. And while this is focusing specifically in California, and a lot of this will focus on the West today, the western parts of the United States, I do want to just briefly mention that more than 60% of land across Hawaii is now considered abnormally dry, and that this is affecting not just the Pacific Northwest and the west coast of the United States, but is in fact infecting the Hawaiian Islands, as pasture lands and fallow plantations on the Big Island have now become yellow-hued and the looks of arid ranches of the American West. So this is actually extending into areas that don't normally deal with this, especially because Hawaii is usually a very tropical and moist climate. So one other factor now that we have to talk about with this is the spark that I mentioned earlier. Now that spark can come in a few different ways. Like I said, we've covered the conditions, right, where all of that happens, where the dry air ends up influencing things and the burnable fuel ends up being created via that process by drying out a lot of the plants, creating that fuel that can be easily sparked into tinder. Now we require that spark. Well, one of the factors is power plants and the electric grid potentially having power outages that go down. If lines go down, they can spark things. Houses nearby can also cause fires just by living conditions and standards. Any spark of fire that a person has in their home could end up lighting up some tinder nearby and starting that fire. But a much more unlikely situation is actually a case that has been occurring far more often as of late. And this was actually part of what happened in the Australian brush fires a few years last year, and they think 2 years ago as well, where pyrocumulonimbus clouds are actually formulating and cyclically creating a lot of these wildfires. Basically, what happens is that the hot temperature of a smoke plume ends up rising into the atmosphere and hitting colder air, which condenses it into a cloud. That cloud now has a thunderstorm that is going over a lot of the other dry areas. Well, some of the downburst from that can effectively create a condition where it puts out certain fires. The lightning can also spark other wildfires nearby and effectively spread the wildfire much more quickly. And so one spark leads to another very quickly in this very cyclical process. Now, with all of this, it's also worth noting that when all of this happens, as forests burn, they also release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so when we have these three conditions met where fires start, they also then send the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which creates more warming gases, which worsens climate change, which raises temperatures and begins the process anew. And that really begins to cycle all of this through, and again creating the conditions that we started with again and again and again. So when we talk about this, we also have to consider the financial costs and the aspects of capitalism that are influencing this and are influenced by this. It is now estimated that as of 2014 through 2018, the federal government spends about $2.4 billion fighting wildfires every year. Now, this is effectively an externality for a lot of the companies who benefit the most from the conditions that cause climate change. Oil companies and any sort of fossil fuel industries, plastics, and so much more that produce carbon dioxide into the atmosphere end up getting their the damage that they cause subsidized by the federal government paying for these wildfires every year. And so this being adjusted for inflation is actually more than twice of what was spent between the years 20 years earlier, between 1994 and 1998. So we're actually spending a lot more money as a federal government to fight these fires, and as climate change gets worse, this cost is just going to go up. And wildfires are not one of those things that you can just say, you know what, we don't want to spend the money on. You kind of have to deal with them because there's a destruction of property that again exacerbates and cyclically creates this process that ends up making climate change worse. But more than that, it ends up putting a lot of people at risk. And That leads us into the next conversation point, which is about land development. Now, in the western United States, forests actually had historically evolved to have low intensity fires that remove underbrush. In fact, a lot of conifers that grow in these areas rely on small amounts of fires to cause the seeds from them to pop out and to reforest the area. So the underbrush of debris and fallen timber gets taken out in much smaller fires. However, for the past century, almost all of the fires have been suppressed, even the small ones, which has allowed forests to maintain denser growths, and that means they have much more of that fuel we talked about, leading to larger and more intense wildfires. In addition to that, development near and into previously wild areas has increased fire risk and made firefighting much more costly, challenging, and dangerous. And that has happened for a couple of reasons. But looking at that on its surface, you have to think that if you have a bunch of houses next to a forest and you're trying to protect people's properties, then what that's doing is making it more difficult because you actually have to protect that property. But in addition to that, we find that when it comes to a lot of this, more development in fire-prone areas puts more people and property in harm's way and brings more electrical infrastructure to spark those fires. If you have to have electricity going to those houses, then that creates more conditions where a downed power line can happen, which can then spark more fires. But it also raises the incentive to suppress them. Successful fire suppression paradoxically actually increases the fire risk by enabling the growth of dense vegetation that serves as abundant fuel in dry conditions. But the controlled burns and vegetation clearings is not something that is a popular solution amongst local communities. Generally speaking, you don't want the area near your house having those small fires that are required or the brush to be cleared because you either expect the state to do it, you don't have the funds to do it, or you just don't want to do it. And so, given all of that, you end up paradoxically creating the conditions to make the area more dangerous. So, by clearing out that small area, if you're not clearing out the surrounding areas, you again create more dangerous conditions. On the drivers of housing growth in what are known as WUIs, or wildland urban interface areas, people are moving closer to nature because of the lower cost of living primarily. But it's also some people who are finding work in areas that depend on natural resources. For example, those who are living near farmland, those in the timber or ranching industries as well. So when homes, roads, and distribution lines are in close proximity to the WUIs, it increases the risk of ignition and the pressure to suppress fires. Because, of course, again, if it's going to affect property and people, then the firefighters are going to have to deal with that in a very different way than how they would deal with it if there were no houses in the area, which can also create more dangerous scenarios for the firefighters as well. The resulting buildup of fuel means that when fires do start, they also burn more intensely and are much more challenging to control. One of these strategies that's often used in order to contain fires is to cut down the trees in the immediate vicinity surrounding the fire so that it has a much more difficult time spreading. And if you're not able to do that because it's on somebody's property and you have to seek permission, or more importantly, it happens in an area where it's right next to somebody's house that might catch fire, you might not have the opportunity to do that and to map it in a certain way that is advantageous to fighting that fire. The long-term risks of fire suppression can be mitigated with precise practices that are involved with vegetation removal. But again, it's a barrier because local landowners don't necessarily want to do that, nor can they. Now, one thing that is worth noting in all of this is the populations that are affected by this. We're finding that Latino populations are in the West Coast are making up about 18% of the US population, but they represent 37% of the people who live in areas that are identified as facing the most extreme wildfire risks. The danger Latino populations face from these wildfires is the latest evidence to show the disproportionate threats that communities of color and low-income people face from climate change. The combination of the shortage of affordable housing and Latino populations growing has pushed people with fickle finances deeper into remote locations that are more susceptible to fires, according to experts who have studied the Latino community and settlement trends in the United States. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, which we will go into, up to and including the fact that they don't want to create affordable housing in certain areas that are pushing populations into areas where they need to go near these potential fire locations. So, in a lot of this, we're dealing with a combination of factors. The geopolitical nature of immigration, and a lot of the things that the U.S. has done to a lot of the Central and South American countries, that as well as Mexico, that are influencing the immigration of people coming in combination with certain cities and locations not wanting to build affordable housing. Couple that with a lot of the poorer populations not being able to get jobs in certain areas that is beyond just Latino populations. It ends up creating this perfect storm of capitalism, ending up creating the conditions where people are putting themselves at risk and are moving more towards a lot of these spaces. You also have to take into account that if people are working minimum wage and low-end jobs, they may not be able to afford some of the fireproofing or some of the care of the land that they need to. And I don't know the amounts of this. This isn't really referenced, but I don't know how many of the people here are renting versus buying. I don't know how many people involved are subject to the landlords that they are with to pay for some of these things like caring for the land, and whether or not that's being addressed at all. So unfortunately, I don't have all that information. But the ballooning housing costs are said to definitely be the primary reason that Latino residents are moving into these areas where they're facing high wildfire risks. According to risk data, the Latino populations in the areas are receiving a score of 5 for the highest wildfire risk, jumped by 223% between 2010 and 2019, compared to areas with no wildfire risk, which indicates that Latino populations are moving into these areas that were the most threatened, while the white population in those areas actually fell by 32%. For areas assigned scores of 3 or 4 denoting high and extreme risk, the median Latino population rose by 37 and 87%, respectively, over that period, while white populations fell by 27 and 12%. So, again, the question really does become, is that land that's being rented now, or is that land that's being sold? I don't have the statistics and data on that readily available, and so I'm just posing that as a question just to think about. A lot of the local officials and voters in wealthy towns like Aspen and Snowmass have resisted pressure to build affordable housing. So again, it's part of this process where a lot of these towns want people to come in and work, but they don't want to build the housing for people to come in and work. And then they want all these people to come basically in from outside, where they can afford maybe property or at the very least rent, and then they're coming in and driving in, which is building housing into these areas where people are being put at risk. So wealthier people in areas like Aspen are making conditions unsafe for people who have to live now in situations and in areas where wildfires are completely an issue. Overall, more houses are being built in unoccupied land, and in the middle of forests and woodlands, known as the wildland-urban interface to accommodate growing populations. About 46 million homes are located in these areas, which is growing at a pace of 2 million acres per year, according to the U.S. Fire Administration. That housing boom represents a 49.4% increase from 30.8 million in 1990. That has put people and property at greater risk while boosting wildfire probabilities. Again, humans start 87% of them, according to the National Interagency Fire Center. And the threat posed by wildfires has not deterred the construction at all, as permits have been allowed. So there's another factor involved in all of that, as a lot of the local areas have allowed permits to go through and allowed houses to be built. Why you are allowing houses to be built in areas that are going to be potentially at risk for wildfires and put people at risk is beyond me. So it's not even just like, oh, the local population is responsible for all this. No, it's actively a group effort where the communities are not providing affordable housing. They are also providing the conditions for people to move into these areas, as well as providing the permits for people to build houses on these lands. So they're creating the conditions that are putting people at risk. And again, that's all incentivized by a capitalist system that prioritizes certain forms of housing and value and markets as opposed to the needs of people. And of course, to the needs of what's going on in these wildfires. As wildfire-prone areas expand and housing options run thin, people are being pushed into ever more dangerous living situations, and then people get it in their head that they're trying to live in these areas, but that's not always the case, and for a lot of people, this is not a choice. And I want to emphasize that. And for a lot of people moving into these areas, putting themselves at risk, it is not a choice. It is a combination of factors that are tied to the socioeconomics of coming into this country, of living in this country in poverty, as well as major areas not wanting to pay for affordable housing, as well as land and ownership and all of the different factors that go into capitalism and that regard. It is a complex issue. Now, one other factor before we delve into who's putting out the fires and the issues surrounding that is the situation involving water. Water has come up throughout all of these different videos that I've covered, and it's no different here. When I talked about the snow melting early, the snow makes up a lot of the viable drinking water for a lot of the different populations in the West Coast. It ends up becoming part of the reservoirs, the rivers, and so many other things that maintain water supplies. Now, if you are someone putting out wildfires, you need water. And it can take, I think, approximately 30,000 gallons to put out a relatively small fire. From what I've been reading, certainly that's what the helicopters tend to carry, in somewhere in that range from what I was finding. Although not 100% on the details with that, but it's certainly a large amount of water that it would require to put out a fire, especially as they get larger and larger. Now, there's been ideas presented of why not use seawater. Well, the reason for that is it damages equipment and can actually damage the soil. If you salt the soil and salt the land, you may prevent things from growing, which may have more dangerous effects in the long run that aren't really being accounted for. So you have to use fresh water, or you have to use fire retardants that end up potentially causing damage to lakes if they run off in and can kill fish. So there's not a lot of good options in that regard, and either way, water gets affected. And as with all of this, with the damage to the soil, with the large clouds of evaporated water, and everything else, it's limiting a supply of water that we often don't have enough of. And that will ultimately have an economic impact as water becomes more scarce if we don't start investing in water filtration systems or desalination processes or so many other factors or ways that we can preserve water, including using less fresh or clean water for agricultural use and possibly other ways. There's just a lot involving water in all of this. Water is going to become a very scarce resource. But dealing with our last issue and how this is exacerbating issues in capitalism, I need to call attention to who is putting out these fires. There are two major groups that I have come across. There are federal and state firefighters that are paid for by the state or the federal government, which, mind you, the federal firefighters are now getting a raise by the Biden administration to $15 an hour as part of a broader strategy to respond to wildfires. A senior administrator official told reporters on Tuesday, this is as of June 30th, that they'll also get bonuses that will raise the equivalent of $15 per hour with a 10% retention incentive. And those who continue through the season will receive a $1,000 reward, and that they're going to hire new firefighters. But I need to be real. $15 an hour is not enough to be paying firefighters who are putting their life on the lines fighting these fires. These fires are burning through places. They are dangerous. They are affecting entire communities. And again, as you have more people on the land, you're creating more dangerous situations as people need to protect property, which again is incentivized by the capital system. And it's just this cyclical thing that just keeps building on itself, where more and more is going wrong. But it gets a little more insidious than even that and the low wages that are involved here. And again, $15 an hour is not enough to be fighting fires. There is no amount that I think is worth putting your life on the line potentially, but certainly $15 an hour, what is being asked for to be the federal minimum wage and was denied by the likes of Senator Sinema, is certainly not what I would put a price on that. It's horrific. But to make matters worse, in Colorado, we're finding that prison inmates, are being used to fight wildfires. And because of the elevated costs that, again, are affecting the state, and the fact that states are not able to pay for a lot of these things to be taken care of, they are now relying on prison inmates who do not need to be paid a minimum wage as part of the carceral system. And through the prison industrial complex, we are seeing people being paid the likes of $12 a day with barely any training, certainly not significant enough training to fight a lot of these wildfires. In fact, since 2002, a program was launched where more than 2,500 inmates have participated in State Wildland Inmate Fire Team, or SWIFT, according to the Department of Corrections. And a new law was actually signed because what was actually happening is that a lot of the people who were inmates could fight fires while they were inmates, but couldn't get jobs afterward. So now they're trying to make it easier for people afterward to get jobs in the industry. That said, they make it sound like people should be grateful for this. People are putting their lives at risk for possibly a slightly shorter sentence and to get a little bit of pay to to fight these dangerous fires. And it's absurd. It's absurd, the lack of care for human life that we are showing with prison inmates. And this is far from the only location with that. Arizona has passed a law that will make it $1.50 an hour for prison inmates to fight fires in over 100-degree weather. California in approximately $1 range a couple of years back. And we're even celebrating this with recent things about women inmates who are fighting California's wildfires. And it just seems to me a very absurd thing to see this celebration like, oh, it's a great thing and it's a great program where people might be able to get like a year off their sentence. No, this is horrific. It is a horrific component of capitalism where a prison industrial complex that is prioritizing people to be put in prisons, oftentimes for profit for corporations and for companies, while other companies are basically causing the conditions that are putting these people's lives at risk in the first place, don't have to pay a cent, while the states have to basically functionally pay into this. And then, to make matters worse, they want to cut down costs, so they seek out prisoners in order to pay for this. And it just ends up cycling on itself. And so what we're looking at in all of this is a set of cycles. Cycle into cycle into cycle, where wildfires essentially do form all of these different cycles in many different ways. The fires themselves spill carbon dioxide into the air, which will inevitably lead to higher temperatures, which will melt snow quicker during the springtime, which will create drier conditions during the summer months, which makes more fires happen, which creates more thunderstorms, which creates more conditions for fires to happen, which can essentially continue that cycle. And then when we get into the incentives of capitalism, it ends up with these companies who produce the conditions that cause damage to the environment, that end up relying on the state to pay for programs because it's an externality to them, which provides less money for other programs, as well as steals water supplies, which is already scarce. And then a lack of affordable housing in certain areas leads to Latino populations primarily, but a lot of different low-income populations moving into the land near the forest, which ends up sparking the creation of more fires and creates more dangerous conditions for the people involved who might lose their homes. And if they lose their homes, they're in worse economic situations, which might put them back into conditions where they have to move further into forest lands, which would, of course, start the process all over again. Meanwhile, there are firefighters out there who are federally being paid $15 an hour, which is meager as can be, while incarcerated individuals are being paid in the likes of $12 a day, which helps support the prison industrial complex and continues that whole cycle that we just spoke about. And all of this cycles upon itself. Capitalism feeding the fires, fires feeding back into creating economic conditions that fuel capitalism, and a lot of negative things involved in between that end up just cyclically feeding each other as if it was just this thing that just perpetually was creating itself. And all of this neatly ties to state-sanctioned industries, the ability for people to buy up the land in these forested areas, and the privatization of all of this that ends up creating conditions under capitalism that ends up making climate change worse and putting more lives at risk. It is a dangerous situation and it needs to be resolved. And in a lot of ways, one of the best ways to start that process is to start building affordable housing in areas where people work and start creating the conditions for people to work in those areas so that less people are in the areas where the fires are, and it can end up starting to reverse some of these processes. Otherwise, we're going to have those three conditions of the spark mixed with the dry tinder, mixed with the actual fires themselves, formulating from dry air, ending up influencing and creating worse conditions. We have the capacity to start working backwards to try to fix this, and it is up to us to create the conditions for that. So with that said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. My name is Anarchist Tara, and I thank you for watching.